Hello, everyone. Welcome to a Wall Street for Main Street podcast special. My name is Dawoud, and our special guest today is Patrick Barron. Patrick Barron has been a consultant to the banking industry since 1985. He teaches bank management simulation at the Graduate School of Banking at the University of Wisconsin, and he also teaches Austrian Economic at the University of Iowa. He has contributed weekly essays in the Austrian vein to the Bulletin Philadelphia since 2006. Patrick, thank you for coming on to the Wall Street for Main Street podcast.
You're welcome, Mo. Glad to participate.
Well, today's first topic I would like to discuss is today's Fed meeting concluded that they rolled out QE4, which will be an additional $40 billion on top of the $40 billion of mortgage-backed security that they will continue to monetize. And I would want to ask you, could you explain to our audience the Austrian definition of deflation and inflation, and why hasn't the U.S. experienced hyperinflation with all the money printing that's being done by the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, I'll be glad to do that. It's a very good question. Well, the Austrian definition of inflation and deflation is a narrower meaning than what is popularly known in society today. The Austrian definition, inflation just means an expansion of the money supply, and deflation means a contraction of the money supply. Of course, today the modern usage is we say we have inflation when we see prices rising generally across the economy, and deflation when we see prices falling. The Austrians say that it's really incontrovertible that the broadest underpinning of monetary theory is called the quantity theory of money, and that is that the more money there is in the economy, the higher the price level will be. That I think is sort of axiomatic. There's no one can really deny that. However, when you expand the money supply, it does not mean that prices will rise quickly throughout the economy, or even that we'll see prices fall when if there's a contraction necessarily, sort of instantaneously. So what causes prices to remain relatively under control when there's this broad expansion of the money supply? Well, what it really means is that the money is not being spent. So when we further delve into the meaning of the quantity theory of money, we find that it's really how much demand there is for money and for money spending as opposed to goods in society. So if the money supply is expanded and the money is really not spent immediately, then prices don't rise. So what's been happening with all this money that the government has been monetizing? Primarily, it has been going into bank reserves, which means that the banks are not lending it, and their excess reserves are going through the roof. So if I can take just a second, Mo, to explain the role of reserves in the economy, is that all right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, in the banking system, the money supply really expands primarily through the banking system and through lending. When the Fed creates excess reserves, then the banks have an opportunity to leverage those reserves into more money and more lending. So when the Fed conducts what it calls open market operations, which means that it buys or sells securities, when it buys securities in the open market, then that means that it buys it with money that it actually creates. And that money comes back into the banking system. When it's cleared, it goes into bank reserves. Now, when the money supply is not expanded much and is kept relatively stable, there are very few excess reserves in the banking system, meaning that the banks are maintaining their reserves at a very fine level because they want to be fully loaned up. That's how they make money. But what we're seeing now is the Fed is expanding reserves, and it's not having any impact on bank lending. Typically in the U.S., before the Fed got into buying all this bad paper that the banks have, or what they're doing now with their QE1, QE2, QE3, now 4, it's going to be into infinity. Before that, excess reserves in the United States were around $2 billion. Now, that's a very small amount of excess reserves in the entire giant U.S. banking system. Excess reserves now are around $1.5 trillion. So just compare that. Instead of $2 billion, excess reserves are $1.5 trillion. That's a mammoth amount of money that the banks are just sitting on in their reserve accounts. There are many reasons that they aren't actually lending that money out or using that money to create loans, but the primary one is that they have suffered a lot of loan losses, and they have to rebuild their capital ratios. So their capital, when a bank lends, then its capital remains the same, but its balance sheet expands. The balance sheet is the numerator in the equation. The capital is the denominator. So that your ratio goes, or I'm sorry, it's the other way around. The capital is the numerator. The balance sheet is the denominator. So when a bank lends, its denominator gets bigger. The capital really doesn't expand until the bank makes money. And so the ratio goes down. So the banks right now are hindered by the fact that their capital ratios have been hurt because they've been writing off a lot of loans, and they really can't. And there really aren't that many good loans out there. Everybody is sort of licking their wounds. So all this money that the Fed is buying or expanding into what we call base money, reserves are called base money. It's not getting into the economy to spending yet. Now, the point is, at some point, banks are going to start getting their balance sheets in order. Their capital ratios are going to be up to snuff, and they're going to start lending out that money. And when that happens, that's going to be a very dangerous time for America. That's when we're going to see prices start to rise, because we're just going to see more money chasing the same amount of goods and services. And that's when we've really got to worry about when we start to see those excess reserves going down. So Murray N. Rothbard, who's a great Austrian economist, wrote he wrote many great books, but one of the books that I've used in my class is his book on the Great Depression. And in the Great Depression, he explains how the Fed could not expand the money supply as it thought. It thought it was just that it could just have absolute control over expanding the money supply, but it couldn't. It could expand reserves, but the banks, because they were having such bad loan problems, were not using those reserves for lending. So they had this deflationary spiral that the country went through. So I'm sorry, this may be a little complicated, Mo, for some of your listeners, but that's what's happening. It's not that the Fed can keep expanding, can keep creating base money forever. It's creating base money by the bucket loads. And this is all very, very dangerous stuff, because when the banks do get their balance sheets in order and things start to look like they're coming back to normal, they're going to start lending again to chase more earnings, and that's when we're going to have they're going to have prices get higher, what the public calls inflation, but what the Austrians would simply call the results of inflation that is already in the system of more money chasing the same goods and services.
And that's a very well thought out explanation of the difference between deflation and inflation. And wouldn't you agree that even though the banks are not lending out to the private sector, to the small businesses to, grow their business, to start their business, the banks are lending to the government so they can continue to fund their big government or social program and to keep the budget deficit running at almost 0% interest? Would you agree with that?
Well, the banks are when they get these excess funds, actually the Fed is now paying interest on their excess reserves. So the banks have even less incentive to lend this out into the private economy. The banks are buying some government bonds, but right now there's a bubble in the bond market, meaning that prices are very high, which means that interest rates are low. That's the inverse relationship between price and yield in the bond market. So right now, rates are very, very low because bond prices are very, very high. But the Fed is buying something like 90% of the bonds that the federal government is issuing. So the Fed is simply monetizing the government's debt, and this debt, they're in effect, when they buy the government's bonds from the Treasury, that goes as an asset on the Fed's books and a liability on the other side of the ledger, which means it credits the checking account of the Treasury, and then the Treasury goes out and spends all this money to sop up, buy votes with, whatever they're doing now, fund their wars and all their social programs, Obamacare and drug treatments and whatever they're doing out there just to keep spending. So that's what's really happening in the economy, is it's all going to the government, and the banks are really being, on the one hand, the monetary authorities and, of course, the government itself, the Obama administration would love for the banks to start lending. But that's sort of what the right hand wants to do in the government. Then the left hand of the government, which is the regulatory authorities at the Federal Reserve and the Comptroller of the Currency and the FDIC, they're all very concerned about the health of the banks and the kind of credits they're putting on the books. So they have been very strict upon looking at bank lending. So it's as typical in a giant government like ours. They have two minds to everything. On the one side, they want the banks to lend. That's the Obama administration side. And then on the other side, you've got the bank regulators that are really looking at banks and saying, well, be very, very careful about what you're putting on the books because we're going to be watching everything you do. So they're very cautious about lending. So instead of just allowing, the market economy to reach an equilibrium, and for the banks with being close to the customers to be able to figure out what's the best for their customers and for themselves and their communities, you've got this bureaucracy in Washington that thinks that they're just pulling these monetary levers. On one hand, flooding the market with money, with base money on the one hand, and then on the other hand, they're trying to build seawalls against this incoming flood of base money against future lending that might be bad. So this is just what happens when you get people in Washington that think that they understand what's really happening in the economy. In my opinion, they should just scrap the whole thing and allow the private economy to decide who banks want to lend to and who wants to borrow from the banks.
And that's the thing that scared people, that let's let the whole thing crash. I mean, if we had free market right now, what would happen is the interest rate would rise, and then we would have deflation in our economy. So our standard of living would rise, our purchasing power would rise, the value of our dollar would rise, and it would adjust all the prices of goods and services, and the wages would adjust as well. And that would be terrible for the economy in the short term, but in the long term, we'll be able to recover faster because, number one, our purchasing power will go up, so people will start saving, and that will create capital, and capital will create the jobs, and that will grow the economy again. So, in essence, deflation is the cure to the disease that's going on in our economy. Is that correct?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I don't like to say that the economy would be bad. We would have what I like to say is, if the government took off all of its shackles of the free market and allowed the free market to dictate prices and interest rates and who the lenders were and how much they lent, then you would see a restructuring of the capital base of America, And the problems you would have would be merely problems that are already here. They would just be revealed. Right now, these problems that we have in the economy, what the Austrians like to call malinvestments, these are investments that are kept going as sort of zombie businesses by more and more credit. General Motors is one of them, for example. It's a zombie business that is kept in business only because the government lent it hundreds of billions of dollars. But all of that would have to be liquidated to some extent, and there would be a great restructuring of the economy. But that would be all to the good. And this is something, Mo, I think that people have to understand that makes Austrian economics different from mainstream or mainline economics, is that we say if you don't want the depression, then don't have if you don't want the bust, then don't have the boom. We say the whole thing is caused by the boom. Everybody else says, well, we want a perpetual boom, and the Austrians say, no, the boom is the problem. The boom is what causes all the malinvestment. The boom is what gets businesses borrowing more money than they should. It gets private individuals borrowing more money than they should, building McMansions that people really can't afford, but this is only revealed later on. So we say that the recession and the bust is necessary to get the economy back on the equilibrium basis. So we're going to have to go through that at some point. Ludwig von Mises was very clear about this when he said, we cannot keep expanding the money supply or base money forever. At some point, we have to stop printing money and allow the economy to reorganize itself under free market principles, and we have to accept the necessary recession that goes with that. Or if we don't do that, then we can have what happened in Germany in 1923 and in Zimbabwe a couple of years ago. We can have an absolute crash of the money and all that goes with it, which is just a horrible thing that happened in Germany in 1923. And modern Austrian historians, anyway, economists and historians, say this was the primary event that brought about the rise of the Nazi Party. The Nazi Party fed off the crash of the Reichsmark at the time, and all that, and it scared the heck out of the German people, and they were ripe for tyranny after that because of the horrible situation they'd had with their money becoming absolutely worthless. So this is what we Austrians say, yes, let's have sound money, and we're not going to kid people and say, well, when you have sound money today, that tomorrow everything will be rosy. No, tomorrow all the malinvestment in the economy will be revealed, and people will be unemployed until we find what they should be really employed in doing. But if we keep the government out of the way and let people work all this out for themselves, then we will have a much quicker recovery than otherwise.
And now the current state of the U.S. economy right now, to me, is that we don't have hyperinflation, but we have some inflation combined with high unemployment. So we're in a long period of stagflation. Do you agree with that? And how long do you think we'll be stuck in this stagflation stage in the U.S. economy?
I do agree with that. I do believe that we are back in what we called stagflation. This is what we had for the younger listeners. We had stagflation, was a term that was came into being in the 1970s when you had a combination of stagnant economy with high inflation, so they coined the term stagflation. And this is what's happening now. The government, we really have stagflation, which means that the economy really isn't going anywhere. The numbers that the government is putting out saying that, well, the economy is growing at 1 or 2%, I think we really can't believe those as meaning anything because the government is flooding the market with money and prices are rising. So in a rising price environment, if you look at, well, what's the gross national product? If the gross national product rises, well, how much of that is just the fact that we're paying more dollars for the same services? when gasoline is what it is today. I just looked all this up just a few days ago for somebody, and when Obama took office in 2009, the number of gallons of gasoline that were purchased in that month were almost identical to the same number of gallons that were purchased in July of this year. And yet the price of gasoline in July of this year was 112% of what it was in 2009 when he took office. I think the price of gas was around $1.80, and price of gasoline this summer was close to $4 a gallon. But yet the government would say, count gross national product, that we multiply the number of gallons of gasoline times $4 a gallon. That's the gross national product for selling gasoline. But we aren't better off for it. We're using the same gallons of gasoline. Yet the government tells us that our economy is improving. So this is how the government, plays around with these numbers. But I do agree that we are in a period of stagflation. Get back to your question of how long we can be in it. It's always hard to say. I really can't predict this. We Austrian economists can say is these are the forces that are acting, because the economy is such a large and complex thing with billions of decisions made every day, and there's no way to read people's mind. At what point will people get fed up and say, well, their prices are getting higher, I'm going to start getting rid of my dollars now because I see that my dollars are going to be worth less next year. At that point, prices start to rise even faster, and it feeds upon itself. When that's going to happen, it's very hard to say. But unfortunately, I don't see that there is any other option to that. I do not see that there's any way that the government is going to have the economy get better by any number of quantitative easing policies that they have. They're just building in the seeds for hyperinflation in the future.
And this country will experience hyperinflation once the velocity of money in this economy start to increase and we start to see banks lend into the private sector.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. The velocity of money really just means that people want to get rid of their money quickly. That's right. That's what happens when prices start to rise. People say, well, I don't want to hold on to my money because, I'm going to start buying things now that I was going to buy maybe in a few months, or I was going to buy next year. But no, I'm going to buy them now because they're going to go up faster in price than my income's going to go up. That's the danger signal. Then it becomes really bad when people say, I don't care what I'm spending my money on. I'm just going to get rid of my money to get something of real value. And at that point, that's when we're done for. That's what happened in Germany in 1923. But it built up. That whole thing built up. Unfortunately, World War I was the catalyst of it, and then the terrible Versailles Treaty after World War I that forced reparations on the German people that they really couldn't pay. So they tried to print their way out of it, and it was an economic disaster. But when people started to see they wanted to get rid of their money for anything of real value, and that's when we have hyperinflation. That's the destruction of money.
And that's a great point there. I want to shift gears here and touch on one final topic before I let you go, and that's the unions. Now, we have the union has been a hot topic in the past couple of months. For one of them, Hostess, is going bankrupt, as you may know. They're the one that make the Twinkie and the Wonder Bread, and one of the downfalls is because, one, bad management, and two, the union has a lot of power over how Hostess operate. Now, I wanted to ask you, since you're an Austrian economist, do you think the union have a place in a free market environment, or should they cease to exist?
Well, that's an excellent question, Will, because a lot of people might think that free market economists are opposed to unions. What free market economists are opposed to is having unions forced upon anyone. We believe that both the laborer can sell his labor in the market for whatever price he wants to sell it for, but that the business owner does not have to buy labor for just whatever the unions say he has to buy for. That it's a free market. In a totally free market where the government gives no special protections for unions or forces companies to necessarily to negotiate with unions, then there is a role for unions as something that is completely different than what we see as unions in this country. It would be a union in which it is the union would go to a company and say, I can bring laborers to you of a certain quality. I can attest to their good character and to their work ethic and to their skills, and I would like you to have a contract with my union that I will bring these workers to you. But the employer could agree to that or not. But that's completely different than what we have in this country. Since the Wagner Act in the 1930s, unions have gotten special protection from the government, and businesses must negotiate with the unions. And then if the business owner does not reach an agreement with the unions and the unions go on strike, then the unions are allowed to blockade the business, to not allow the employer to hire people for whatever wage free market labor would like to buy. Then you have all this union violence. This is all terrible consequences of misdirected union legislation in the 1930s, and we're still suffering from it today. But in a free market, there is a role for unions, but a union would be completely different than it is today. It would be a union of voluntary people that get together and negotiate with employers to bring good workers to that employer and make his business better than it was in the past.
And the last thing the U.S. would like to see is become the next France, where the union over there is very powerful and have a lot of control over how businesses operate over there.
Yes,
we wouldn't want that over here.
Well, that's right. In fact, that's what you can look at France. I was just reading about there's a steel company that is losing money. We don't really know why. I understand that there is a large glut of steel making capacity in the world today. So this French company is losing money, and they want to close down their plant because they just can't afford to stay in business. And the unions are lobbying the government to use the coercive power of the government to force that company to stay open, just so they can keep their jobs. But the market doesn't need their jobs. Unfortunately, the market says there's too much steel in the world, and we don't need the steel from that French company. So, but yet that's just a way to drive the entire country into bankruptcy. I don't know what the French are going to do. Typically, what they would do is they would nationalize, which means the government would just buy that steel company from the stockholders for whatever arbitrary price that the government said they had to sell it to them for, and then they would use tax dollars to keep those people employed, and they would produce steel that nobody wants. That's what we do not need in this country.
And unfortunately, in some part of our country, we do have that. If you look at the auto industry, exactly. where we nationalized GM, and they're not performing well compared to the competitors.
No, I mean this was ridiculous. Just like the whole financial situation in 2008, where Washington was panicked into I think George Bush said, this sucker is going down. What was I to do except to give everybody $800 billion of money? And but especially egregious was General Motors. General Motors has suffered for decades at the hands of their unions, and probably poor management too, but at the hands of the unions who have where the company was forced to accede to higher wage demands, horrible work rule demands. Then the Environmental Protection Agency came along and played into the hands of the Japanese automakers by raising the fuel standard requirements that our car makers really were not prepared to meet. There was no reason to meet those higher fuel standard requirements because gasoline was cheaper in America. We wanted big, comfortable cars in our big country, and why not? I mean, this is what people wanted. And then, bad decisions over time. So now that the government, through its regulations and through its support of the unions, has driven General Motors to bankruptcy, then they come along and they give General Motors lots of taxpayer money just to bail those unions out instead of allowing General Motors to have an orderly bankruptcy. If General Motors had an orderly bankruptcy, I guarantee you most of those auto workers would have been back to work within a couple of years, but they would be working for Japanese companies.
Oh yeah, I agree. And well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Patrick Barron, thank you for coming on for Wall Street for Main Street podcast. If people want to find out more about what you do, where can they go?
Well, they can go to, I have a blog. It's www.patrickbarron@blogspot.com. It's PATRickBarron.blogspot.com. And that's my blog, and I post things every week.
Great. Well, thank you for coming on. Hopefully you can come back on in the future.
My pleasure, Mo. Thank you for having me.